now the Tambanyasha, she do the Tambanyasha said the Kanish Tambanyashaki, Mipa Yudi Karelamna, and the Chidane, Descensional Park Shadu, Luda, Sem, Torwata, Sem, na Chö, she, Dishiti, Najamanyashi Mipares. Dam Tambanyasha said, and a Kanisla Waresne, Udenigi, Lu, Tor. Towa sem chö shiba kanru chile mi che ane kaso rangi tsingi dan chi tsingi nini yi kwa ne da shen jie che ane jie pe zhamba tang shirab ki du pe ke lam shu ki khenpa di la ane zhamba nye sha se che ngor ma son na dini chi la go re she de odus che.
We've been looking at the practice of the 4 close placements of mindfulness. We've seen that there are 4 objects that are observed. The first is the body, the second is feelings, the third is mind, and the fourth is phenomena. Then, that's the first outline, the second outline is how to meditate on these 4. So each of them individually, one first holds with mindfulness and then investigates with wisdom, investigating first the specific characteristic and then the 4 general characteristics relating to each of the 4 objects, of the observed objects, respectively.
Adinigi Jambanya said it in China, then Ganes Kumgores and Lula Mine, Miu Lula Mine, and the Rangi Chingida, Chi Singing Nini. Dana Gombaja, Chiche, then Soala Miche, Ranget singing that she singing Ni Dana Gombachibas. Then Semla Miche, then again, I ranget singing that she singing that Jabachacom, Gomia, then a chela Miche, Ranget singing that she singing Dana Gombachiache. Lula Mine Ranget singing that she singing Ni Dana Gombachibas, I think it's also that Digo she started around the Inea, and the Lula. Dina Xin Jiang Zui Ne Lu La Mi Jie, the Rangi Chen Yin Yu Guan Yang Zui Ne, Du Xin Jieba Jie Wu Re, such a tissue.
So again, then for each of the observed objects, starting with the body, one holds the observed object with mindfulness and investigates with wisdom, investigating first the specific characteristic and then the 4 general characteristics. And then one does this for the body. Thereafter, for feelings, one holds feelings with mindfulness, investigates with wisdom, investigating first the specific characteristic and thereafter the general characteristics. Then one moves to the 3rd observed object, that of mind, and one holds that with mindfulness, investigates with wisdom, investigating first the specific characteristics and thereafter the 4 general characteristics. And the same then with phenomena, the last of the 4 observed objects. Of these 4, we've looked at the first, the close placement of mindfulness on the body, which is first the specific characteristic that is investigated, and thereafter the general characteristics.
Midabadi Ji Tsing, Dunga was a Ji Tsing, and Dong was a Ji Tsing, and Dame was a Ji Tsing, it is Ji Tsing. Then the Lugi Dendo, Rangi Tsing, Jebache Comyata, and Ji Tsing Midaba, and the Jebache Comna Jikje. Then that Lugi Dendo, Ji Tsing, Dungawa, and the Jebache Comna Jikje. And Lugi Dendo, and Dash Dongba, the Dash Ranging to Dongbadi, and in
this morning session, then, we looked at the how to investigate the the specially characterized. I mistyped this. How to investigate the specific characteristic of the body, and that was to investigate its elements, those being the 4, earth, water, fire, and wind, and the 4 composites of the elements, namely the objects of form, sound, smell, and touch. So that is the specific characteristic of the body. And thereafter, we looked at the first three of the four generally characterized objects. First, general characteristics, namely impermanence, suffering, and emptiness. And empty of, here in this context, means empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent. So that's the first three of the four general characteristics. The first general characteristic, where one investigates the person, seeing that it is empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent, this is the coarse selflessness of persons. The coarse selflessness. Then, sorry. So, so the third general characteristic, that of emptiness, refers to coarse selflessness of persons, where one investigates as being empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent. Then the final general characteristic of selflessness refers to the subtle selflessness of persons. The text only refers to selflessness, but implicitly it is referring to selflessness of persons. In other words, it doesn't state selflessness of persons, just selflessness, but the meaning is selflessness of persons. The term then emptiness is referring to to coarse selflessness of persons, with the person being empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent. We've looked at that, and I've yet to come to the fourth general characteristic, selflessness. And selflessness refers to the subtle selflessness of persons, the person being empty of being self-sufficient, substantially existent. In this morning's session, then, we looked at how the person is empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent, because the person is empty of being permanent because the person changes momentarily, moment by moment. Therefore, the person is impermanent and empty of being permanent. Secondly, the person is empty of being unitary or empty of being single, meaning that the person, and that is because the person is not single, but rather dependent on parts. And then thirdly, the person is empty of being independent because the person is dependent on many causes and conditions.
gansa la chane shigo ma da phumbo khorong sam ta shigo phumbo khorong kichi jigba yin za taba ma re sen phumbo khorong gyugin le teba za rawa ma re sen phumbo khorong chashi le teba yin za ane chashi ma jibu wa ma re cheza phumbo di sumga gin chokbe ge chokwa de ma re sen sam ta de ro
where this morning and perhaps now I've said in terms of emptiness, referring to the person being such, Gen is now corrected to say it's really about the aggregates being empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent. So where earlier I said person, I should have said aggregates, and likewise now. So the aggregates, they are not permanent, they are impermanent. They're empty of being permanent because they change momentarily. The aggregates are empty of being unitary because they are dependent on parts, and the aggregates are empty of being independent because they are dependent on causes and conditions.
Tadi jikshye sara. Da yangya jeba chetan chikla, ane da gansa asayadi, kiji jikba re mato, gansa, kiji majibe takpa gansa cheya yo ma re. Gyugyen lama dubeke rangwaan drupduken gansa cheya yo ma re, gansa de gyudan kyen la dubba re. Da chashe lama dubeke, ane pungpo lama dubeke, diniki chashe lama dubeke, gansa cheya yo ma re, kiji nga shiki chashe de pungpo lama gansa yo ma re. Me banza gansa asayadi, gansa diniki sum choduke, sumka yungo drupdukengi gansa cheya beresini yo ma re chirwa. Gansa gyudan kyen la dubba re, gyudan kyen la ma dubbe gansa yo ma re chi. Gansa de kiji jigu re, kiji majibi gansa cheya yo ma re chirwa. Gansa de chashe la dugo re, chashe la ma dubbe gansa cheya yo ma re. Gansa da gansa gyudan kyen la ma dubba, kiji mijikba, chashe la ma dubbe, dine sumka choduken gansa cheya besini yo ma re chi. Dine gansa cheya bayina, dine gansa chila dakshe rangwaan jinyu dubbe gansa lagi re si. Chasang dine ki meba yinza dakshe rangwaan jinyu dubbe gansa yo ma re si chirwa. Dan dine ki gansa dakshe rangwaan jinyu dubbe gansa di dine gansa meba yinzang suki pungpo di dine ki dakshe rangwaan jinyu dubbe gansa digi long jejer ma re si. Long jejer ma dhubba re si. Long jejer ma dhubba re si. Ko gansa dine gansa digi pungpo di beche tanya ma re si. Rwa di beche tanggo ma re si. Chasang pungpo di dakshe rangwaan jinyu dubbe gansa ki long jejer ma dhubba re si. Chasang dine ki sam tanya di da gansa dame rakpa pungpo tendo jeba che su chagurwa ma dhubba re si. Jeba che tandi dine ki sam tanya di gansa dame rakpa pungpo tendo ma dhubba ane jeba che tang chagurwa. Chasang di sam tanya jikti chagurwa.
So therefore, we've looked at how the aggregates are empty of being permanent, empty of being unitary, empty of being independent. And in relation to the person, this is the case too. There is no person that is permanent. Person is empty of being impermanent because it changes momentarily. Moreover, there's no person that is unitary. The person is dependent on parts, and therefore the person is empty of being unitary or single. Thirdly, there's no person that is independent. Rather, the person is dependent on causes and conditions. Therefore, the person is empty of being independent. So the reasoning here is the same. So because the person is empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent, there is no aggregate that is utilized by a person that is permanent, unitary, and independent. So I'll say this last sentence again because it's new for us now. Because the person is empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent, there is no aggregate that is utilized by a person that is permanent, unitary, and independent. And this understanding or this realization is a realization of coarse selflessness of persons.
Da phumbe tendo tashe rawa jing dribe tongba sam tanda de la ane kansa tashe rawa jing dribe ki dame ba tongwa sam tanda di kansa tashe rawa jing dribe kansa khorong dene shaje dene ki kansa me ba za phumbo di kansa dene kansa lonche je madubare sam ta je ba ji di ane kansa tashe rawa jing dribe tongwa di sam tanda che gorwa da dene ma san je phumbo khorong ngo yula de bare again giji gore chashela gore is that dini za phumbo khorong ngode gyudan ki gen chashya kalama rawang sunga drupde ge mare samta de de kansa tachorwa ju drube kansa de samtang go marwa khor phumbo khorong ngol samtang gorwa je da de samtang ha ro kha ni ro chagdwa.
I want then this to be clear because there are two different ways of approaching this, but they sound very similar. So, when reflecting on the aggregates, such as the body, one is reflecting on the essence or the entity of the aggregates. One is not engaging in reflection on the person. So when one is reflecting on the entity of the aggregates, one reflects that the aggregates are empty of being permanent, they're empty of being unitary, they're empty of being independent. Thereafter, one may well reflect on the person being empty of being permanent, empty of being unitary, and empty of being independent. The reasonings will be the same. And then after one can go a little deeper and say, because the person is empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent, there are no aggregates that are utilized by such a person. So the reasoning is the same. What is being investigated differs. Firstly, the aggregates are investigated, and they are seen to be empty in these three ways, as then thereafter is the person, and thereafter, and because the person is empty in these three ways, there can be no aggregates that are utilized by such a person.
Kansa dame chamot da kansa dame no de kansa dame chamot lo go ore jidan de michna kansa dame la yon de namsa kansa dame chamot la go ro da da dang zo ge kansa dame chamot de ji chen za chue tam je ge de yo ban za da phumbu de do kansa dame chamot de sam na dang na de da je ba je kom na de da je ba je ne ka so re zhan pan ye xia kom na de xie go ro ba. 다 강사 다음에 지천제 강사 다음에 세디 다 최 탐제 있는 요들와 당 아주 가르쳐 월선 미다바 동아 되게 되시 시사로와다 다 강사 다음에디 풍부의 때도 간이 제바 체조 겁나데 잠바다 시럽 된전 잠만이 겁나데 시고로 와지다.
That was a review then of what we've looked at thus far. Now we can come to the fourth of the general characteristics, and we'll looking at it in relation to the body. But here, with selflessness, really it's specifically referring to the subtle selflessness of persons. So what one will be investigating here is the subtle selflessness of persons that relies on the aggregates.
다 풍부의 때도 당한 저게 다음에 봐도 제바지 공부하라 녀라 다가하고 그래서는 다음에 봐 호론을 제바지 오르다 뭐 다음에 봐 호론을 제바지 오래 지난 다음에 봐야 돼 제바지 다음에 봐 제바치는 되니 풍부의 때도 나 다음에 봐 제바지 공부해야 되로.
Before then investigating the aggregates that the self relies on, one starts to investigate selflessness. And starting with a person or the I.
하고 어디에 침묵하고 그래서 다음에 받자바 제발라 담보 다디 nga 세디 로리아 낭다디 간이 난고래 데 낭네 로기 진야디 간이 징기도 세디 니하고 고르와다 당보디 하고 고르 니하고 차네 데네 나와 나신 다디 두민도 제바제 차고르와.
First point of the meditation on selflessness is to understand clearly how the self or how the person appears to us. So how does the self or the person appear to us, firstly? And then secondly, within the same first point, we need to see how the person or the self appears to us so that we can understand how it is apprehended, how do we apprehend the person. So this is the first step.
Dine zadang zuge nga sedi sosorang samdache nga sedi jiyore da nga sedi tu samda sosor lola kane shawdu sempige de simju re chegore dine simju che de ane nga zule lola kare shawgo kane shawgo sene nga de lola ya shawyo du jiga gangla ya ma de ba gyudan jian da pungbo la so ba chashe la so ba kaya ma do korong weni yue de ba ru ji nang go re nga zo lola ya nang go re jisan di koran chipu chi suji ala demo koran ngene rangya tubala koran ngene ne tubasi ko rangya tubala denege koran ngene ne tubaru chi nangorwa dene nawa nashi dene ji yore nawa nashi ji yore sam jimbe jimba delada kasa rangya tubi jesu me jimbala korwa lole nayan dene nawa nashi dene yore sam jimbe jimba de kasa rangya tubi jesu tubi jimbe jimbala korwa. 제에 람나 가지고 제에 람나 오버라고 가서 랑게 투비 제에 람나 강라에 뭐 랑공원에 네 투에 그 오버듯이 걸어와다 근데 지바래 제에 람나 말람나 랑게 투비 제에 걸로 나에도 가서 강사대 풍보다 차체 강라 랑공원에 줍디게 코롱원에 네 투바 있는 거로와 디 제에 나서다가 dimbe 하마요 말 제에 람나 디르와디 디 나서디 나서 너를 가서 되는 는 거래서 나서다 하고 걸어와 Dinawa nasi yore se jinyo da rangye tubi se su tubi jimba se je la ngo ba se ora ko gansa de ngo ba jing ko ro rangye tubi ge ko ro ngen tubi ge ngo ba yin ba jimba je su tubi jimba la ko.
In terms here of meditating on the I, we start with ourselves, with our own sense of self-identity. How does our sense of self-identity appear to us? What appears to our mind in terms of our own sense of self-identity? And we see that we appear to be independent, not influenced by anything at all, not influenced by causes or conditions or parts, not influenced by anything at all, independent. So this is the meaning of being self-sufficient, that the person appears to be independent. And then in terms of being substantially existent, here, that the person does appear to be a functioning thing. But primarily how we appear to the mind, our sense of identity appears to the mind, is being independent.
Denige nangsu da samla de nangsu de pa lo ya ya wo xia yang de de di na wa na xin chi da nga xia de jesu tu ba la de ko ngo bo jawa chi khen gi de ne gi be jawa chi khen gi nga xia de ni chi ko zu ge na zu phung be de do ga wa du phung bo da sem da de ne de ya je ba chi de ne ga ya nie me de ni gyo ma lo me de ne da xia de rangwani tupike da xia de mindu sempege da da xia mindu sempege di ligorwa.
When it's clear, when one has a clear understanding of how our I appears to us, our sense of self-identity appears to us, then our investigation, looking for it, will go well. Because of course we'll look in the physical aggregates and the mental aggregates, and we'll come to see that there is no such independent self, no self-sufficient, substantially existent self to be found at all.
Denege dus samdaje dene Da me ba se ha go yong de dine ga sa se di Pumbo dan che kala ma rang ngun ni zhuba lo le na wa na xin ga sa ji yue bai ne de le ya ga sa da du zhu bi de ni ge lo le na wa na xin ga sa ji yue bai ji de ni ge ja wa ji gen da ji ni ge ja wa ji tu ga sa ji yue bai na ga sa rang ju tu bi ze su zhu ba le go le ze se rang yu tu ba je ze se no ngo bo de ni ge du je ja wa ji gen ji ze se go de ni ge yue bai na de ga sa rang yu ji zhu ba se ji san de ni ji de ga sa de me yo de 지상 디니 매바자 대시 풍보디 아다 풍보디는 삼당와 디니 풍보디 데니게 랑게 투비게 제수투베 간사 디기 간사 매바자 대세 간사 디기 롱제자 말레스 다 롱제자 말레스 디니 간사 디기 베셰 따야데 말레스 하지 하고 고르와 데니게 하고 고야도 나 지금 고미야데 삼제 템바테 셰랍기 제바지 고미야도 데디테도 풍보디도 아니 지체니 다음에 가서 다음에 장유도 지수를 동화디 풍부에도 공비게는 잠만야샤서라고.
First one, concentrates on getting a sense of how our self-identity, our I, appears to us, and then seeing that it appears to be independent, not influenced by anything at all, under its own control, own power. We then investigate, looking in the physical mental aggregates, and we cannot find it. Which means that there's no such person that exists in the way that it appears as being self-sufficient, substantially existent. So therefore, we come to an understanding of subtle selflessness. So this is the subtle selflessness of persons. Then we say, well, if there's no such person or self that exists in the way that it appears as being self-sufficient, substantially existent, there is no such person that is utilizing the aggregates. So that would be the next step. The first is to do with the person, seeing how it appears, investigating, seeing that it doesn't exist in that way, in the way that it appears, and therefore, second step, therefore, there is no such person, because there is no such person that exists in the way that it appears, no such person can be utilizing the aggregates. So in this way, we engage in the meditation of the close placement of mindfulness on the body through the general characteristic of selflessness, utilizing mindfulness and wisdom.
지상 알아주 규라 가려 열에서네 가사 세리 풍보다 채시에 갈라에 뭐 그런 거니 줍두긴 아니 가사디 파 레레헨로시 차상 알아주 풍보를 봐 지금 배셔 당한 루디 데네 가사지 알아주 로리아 나체 나신 데네 가사지 요래 섬진 진거로 지상다 진영장 아주 가르삼 거로서네 아주 섬나라 가려 열에서네 데네 가사디 아주 풍보들 배시던 거래지 롱주고래 배시던 거래서 제가 아주 변에 풍보 공부하자 줘야 되는 것을 나와 정한주 풍보에 많이야래 아니 공부하자 줘야 돼 풍보 구겨 수보디 구겨다 배시다 차상 가사기 배시던 거로 받아 제가 배시다 데네게 가사디 배시던 거 요바딩 아주기라 삼론 하려야 요래 받아 제가디 예 삼로디 너트 차대요 받아 제가 데네기 제바체 고 잠반예샤 삼다 제고 공묘도 제바체도 데네기 가사지 매바래 데네 가사 매바자 데네기 가 저기 수고를 야 배시당 그 풍부디 배시당한테 데네 가사되기 배시당 거마다 다 배시마다 와인장 아주 풍부디 데네 가사되기 롱제자 거로 말해 배시당에 말해서 거로 와
If this sounds a little strange, it would be because the very first step of the meditation, which is seeing how the sense of self-identity appears, that is something that you haven't yet got that much familiarity with. Because the way our sense of self-identity appears is it appears to be something that's independent of causes, conditions, parts, and so forth. In other words, it's something under its own power, own control, and makes and is in control of, or is the controller of, the aggregates. It can utilize the aggregates. So the person appears as if it's separate from the aggregates, utilizing, making use of, controlling the aggregates. This is how the person appears. So we investigate, seeking such a self-sufficient, substantially existent person, coming to see that no such person exists. The person doesn't exist in the way that it appears. So here one comes to realize the subtle selflessness of persons. So again, the way the self appears to us is being like a controller of the aggregates. It's the self that determines for the aggregates to listen, to lie down, to walk. It's the self that seems to be in charge. And we've investigated now, and we're seeing no such self can be found. No such self that is a controller or in charge of the aggregates. No such self that is independent. That this way of thinking is mistaken. So we investigate here, and we first come to see that the self does not exist in the way that it appears, and that's called the subtle realization of subtle selflessness of persons. Thereafter, we recognize that because the self does not exist in this way, there is no such self then that is utilizing the aggregates, making use of the aggregates, or controlling the aggregates.
Kansa is the Pumbona Chacha Kalama Rangoni, Rangya Tube Zesutuba, Nangore, Zugile, Nangore, Nanajin Zingore, in a Zimiti, Lodi Yanzo, Hangisi or Hangia, Lo, Hangia, Hanzo, how to go, how go, Marabada, how go, Martin, Lodi, Zinguba, how go, Mar, then Nanguba, how go, Mardanzugi, how go, Mar. Chisanazo, how Garrison, how go, Martin Chabakora, Jigo, Majebaro, Chisana Jabakora, Majebaro. Chisana Dinigi. Jeba cheche lolia ganesh nangdu sibe ngade ganesh du ta lolia na de ganesh nangdu sin pa jeba cheche du che samda de yane ya do samda de gansam chilia lolia odenish nangdu sibe na de ha ku ku re jisan da me ba to ya ge jeba che la dang bo di ha ku ku ra ji na de ha ku deni ge na de ha ku sa che ya da deni na ya de deni lo yi ge jin de le ganesh jing du sin dine nawa nashin jingdu sebe da hago to gorwa chisna da nawa nashin jimba ina dine ge da nga se de nawa nashin nga di kangla ma to rang ngene jesu dubde he nga di se de duye se ganesh du da gawa yore sin di chipa jeba cheje ji nga zo ge mo phungpue tin do jeba che da semi tin do jeba che du jeba che gazam chile dine ge digune 통고 말하다. 근데 다 제바제 통고 말. 지산 되게 지산 타마타마들이야. 되는지 민두 선별로 얘기하고라. 민두 선별 삼로 리고로 와. 지산 민두 선별 삼로 내도 다음에 비니스도 하고 그러와. 다 되는게 다 나와나지 민두 선별 하고 세회 지야라. 하는 가용으로서는 나와나 요래 선별 삼로 짐바디 달로 노출에 샤서 하고 두고다. 딜로 노출에 샤스. 지산 딜로 노출에 디 노출이 디 원게 당하서래 지 착바기야다 차상로 노출 디 원게기도 지산 디 노출 용사가 로 노출 자와디 디레 샤스 하고 두고다.
The person, to all of us, the person appears as if it is independent, as if it is separate from the aggregates, a controller of the aggregates, that the aggregates are under the control of the self. So the self that appears to be self-sufficient, substantially existent, appears to us, to all of us, but yet it doesn't exist in this way. Despite it not existing in this way, we grasp, a separate consciousness grasps at the self as if it existed in this way, or grasps that or believes that it exists in this way. This is something that's innate to all of us. And because it's innate to all of us, we are completely unaware. This is how we've always gone about our lives, life after life, always just going around believing that the self exists in this way without even thinking about it. And it's because we've never thought about it that we are oblivious to it. We are unaware. However, should you put time and energy into coming to see exactly how the self does appear to us, then you'll no longer be blind to this, oblivious to this, unaware of this. And thereafter, your investigation will start to have a profound impact, because then one will come to understand that the self doesn't exist in the way that appears. But the starting point is to look carefully, how does my sense of self-identity appear? Thereafter, to the degree that one has a clear understanding of how our self innately or naturally appears to us, to that degree, our investigation within our physical aggregate and our mental aggregates will be transformative. Because it's when we come to realize, I cannot find such a self anywhere, we come to an understanding of selflessness. And when we understand selflessness, we understand then that the ignorance that grasps at the self as being self-sufficient, substantially existent, completely mistaken. And therefore, all the afflictions that arise from this wrong consciousness really come from a false basis. In this way, we start to shake up our own reality.
Dusine Jabachidi da Delia and Dusin Jabachidi, Gansamjilia, Gabrielia, Chetal, Nyangachawore. The Dusi Jabachi Gansa, the Gansa said, Mindu Sempeta, do Jabach Mani do Gansa, Mindu Sempelia, Tin Semlia, Ambrada, Shenayung. That Mindu, Sempe, Shenayung. The minute I said Mindu Sempetachi, Mindu Sempeki Chatale, Nyangayung, Chazadenia, Dinigi Jabachi Kabla, Unjig Sunam Lamada, Lama Idamlia, Sunam Soataviada, Unjig Sosa Joya, and Delia Lama, Sosugi, Yamyoga, Lama Delia, Anji Gentishuada, Ducine, Gasore, Lamigi, Danyamanma, Mambo, Chikma, Lamas and Mambugi Dami, or Yamnenchita, Shutada, Dinma, Samia Potayada, and the Pejinalia, Sonshapetia, Shimjuya, was said, Dinichi Majabena, Chetatoyagi, Yangali, or that didn't das or the Yomarda says big, Tangoni Yomarda, Yomar, as a big Chetato and Yangayumore. Tisadineza, Shenai, Ligre, Cheta, Ligur, Yangayor Sudua, then the Yungure Siduada. Danganzu Dagumaranga to come get Meva Zadiagumara Denigi. That Denizin and down, Denigi Jeba Chetangi Tone, and Jumdasus Midaveda, Da said, and Da said, Yorova down. Now Nashin Dash Mena, Gansa Yorova, and I Yoredan, China Kalasegor, and I Lagaligore, and Jebachi and the Jebachi or what, Nayor, and I Menagat Jebacho. Sang Yore, that didn't Singari love you do. Didn't Jumda Sosorangi. And it Kashigi Suti, Naresha Sada. Ada Pene, the Niki Semzambaruchin, that the Sudi Chagmaridini, Cousin Kushinam, she said in Ares, and I said the Gasa gets Sijumuni, Gasa Suris, Kushinam Shabadi, said Pashayada. Then, and it Umaranju by Nada, E number Shiba Tamodida, Gasa Diri, said the most. Dele Gansa Shagudus, the E number Shiba Tramo de la Gansas Lago, just a Digansa Shaguds and be Takju di Chicore. That Gala Maduva Rangun when you drew to the parts in the money do that Gansa Yun Yore, and the Garishagus, that E number Shiba the Tramo Shagudu, Garilana E number Shiba Tramodi. Gyälwa Kawa and a Koyo, but E number Shiba Tramo do, she that Yore. And the Gizima, she did the ma, the Gyälwa de Chasana, draw to E number Sheba to dos. Chesa, that E number Sheba de Gasa, Shahu do some border, Casting Gyälwa Dene, Marchim, to Chasana, draw to E number Sheba, just not the E number Sheba Shahus be, the E number Sheba Gasa gets century said that Maraju be in a Shayong. The same time big as was E number Sheba Ladu. Da Gansa Shamna Dian Jigim in the Karzana, gokpa nyambar shaba se chagore. Chizan chiza sem chasan gokpa nyambar shaba. Gokpa nyambar shaba se chi komya chi yore kono zuge. Komya chi tele ya sem chasan kagore, sem kiye yo mare chere. Chizan sem chasan ka sara yo mares. Chizan igi sheba yo mares. Chizan ine kansa de nyambar shado yores. Chizan igi sheba yo mare. Dati igi sheba de kansa rela na digi mindusam. Da kono zuge gala warasane kunshin namshe se adi sem tembu shuchi yores da. 제가 샘잠비게 샘 템보세 제 군신 넘버 셔바세 샤제 데디 가자레스 코너스 디샤고 샤고라 난 제라 마와나라 망보라 가시기 다 풍보가가 수기 풍보 소유 풍보 도시 넘버 풍보가가 가사레라고도 세다 가시기다 풍보 가사레라고도 세다 되네 가시기 샘 지부 가사레라고도 세 되네 가사 랍나 케레나데 미러 뭐 차사래 가시가 어디 제라마는 풍부에 나가 가사래 수기 풍부 가사 초유 풍부가 두제 나버시 풍부 나가 가사래서 켈링엔 중화래 아니 풍부 직 아니 풍부 호란 직대 가소래 가사래서 켈링엔 중화래 근데 셈지부 가사래서 켈링 되네게 다 소수기 옹부 미대위 토네 가사 켈링 망보라 중으로 다 내가 텐주비 제바진도 제대 제사다 셈기 때에도 군신 남시셔야 돼. 이기 남시셔. 제소에 강사 차기 말해. 지금도 제바시나 강사 써야 돼. 르파 따바섬지마도 요 말에 세네. 셈기 때에도 요 말 군시디에 강사만 이기 남시셔 강사 말했어. 제사다고 르파 따섬지마도 요 말에 써야지 시고다 텐유비. 제사 권주기 강사 제바 제제 강사 로라 나와나시 마주바 인상 다 강사지 유연요 후고래. 안내 간에 지어래서리 다 좀더 수수라는 걸 코소직바 야루기 토네 안에 강사샤라 천신 미도샤다 미도 차송으로 와다 되는 샤를 내버려.
In this meditation, we heard then the first step is to see with vivid clarity how our sense of self-identity appears. And to the extent that we are successful in seeing how the self appears, to that extent, our searching for such a self, to see if such a self exists in the way that appears, will have a transformative effect on us. And it's very common that as one is engaging in transformative in this meditation and coming to deeper and deeper understandings, then it's quite common that fear will arise within one, because one comes to the thought of, I can't find this self, the self that appears innately to me. I've looked repeatedly, and I cannot find it anywhere. The self therefore cannot exist. I do not exist at all. And then fear arises. And here there is the very real danger of falling into the extreme of nihilism. So at this point in one's meditation, we need to do a few things. We need to, firstly, we remind ourselves that such an experience, it's normal, it's nothing to be shocked or surprised about. All the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas would have had such an experience of the ground becoming suddenly very unsteady under their feet, a fear that the self doesn't exist at all. And moreover, we then turn towards our lama and the three jewels, make supplications for ongoing success in our meditations, and that we come to a correct understanding of selflessness. Thirdly, we make ever more effort in our accumulation of merit to dedicate to the accumulation of merit and dedicate this, and also this accumulation of merit powers our meditation. So we accumulate ever more merit, and fourthly, we study further, gain more knowledge. And this way, we will move beyond this fear, because this fear it comes about in dependence on fearing that the I doesn't exist, the self doesn't exist, and that there is a possibility of believing this and falling into the extreme of nihilism. But through continuing in the way that I've mentioned now, by reminding ourselves that this is normal, it's nothing actually this is to be expected, make supplications to our lamas and 3 jewels, to accumulate ever more merit and to study further, we will progress past this. So here, we recognizing now that the self does not exist in the way that it appears. But there is clearly still a self. For example, there is a self, someone engaging in this meditation. And if fear is arising, there's someone experiencing fear. So there is still a self. And how that self exists? Well, there are varying explanations. By the varying Buddhist philosophical schools, or the Buddhist tenets, they have varying presentations. And depending on the aptitude of the individual practitioner, they will be inclined and accept a particular explanation. So, for example, if we think of the Vaibhashika, or in English, the Great Exposition School, there are many subdivisions to all the schools, but in particular this one, and therefore they have many illustrations of the self. Some Vaibhashikas state that the self that exists is the 5 aggregates, the collection of the 5 aggregates. Some say, no, it's only one of the 5 aggregates. Some say it's the mind. So here, within the Vaibhashika, there are a variety of illustrations of the self. The Chittamatrans, or let's rather do the Svatrantikas first. The Madhyamaka Svatrantikas, or the Middle Way Autonomous School. They assert that the illustration of the self is a very subtle mental consciousness, because it's the subtle mental consciousness that travels from lifetime to lifetime. There's always the subtle a mental consciousness present, and it is this that travels from lifetime to lifetime. Therefore, it is this that is suitable to be the illustration of the self. It is this that is the self. The Chittamatrans, or the mind-only school, they disagree. They say, in deep meditation, even the subtle mental consciousness is absorbed or dissolves. So therefore, even subtle mental consciousness is not suitable to be the illustration of the self, and they pose an additional mental consciousness that no other schools present or assert, and they present a mental consciousness, a primary consciousness, a main mind, called the mind basis of all. And they say, this is stable. Subtle mental consciousness, this primary consciousness, these main minds, are not stable enough to be the illustration of the self. The mind basis of all is. But it's only the Chittamatrans who assert this additional primary consciousness. Then the final philosophical school, the Prasangikas, or the consequent school, the Madhyamaka Prasangikas, the middle way consequent school, they say that this illustration of the self is not some or all of the aggregates, it's not the mental consciousness, it's not even the subtlest mental consciousness, and it's certainly not a mind basis of all. The self is rather only imputed by mind onto the aggregates. That's all. There's no other self to find than this. Other than the self being imputed by consciousness onto the aggregates, there's no other self to find but this. So here we see that according to the different Buddhist philosophical schools, there are different presentations on what self can be found. What self can be found, what serves as a correct illustration of the self. So no Buddhist school will say the self doesn't exist. That is an extreme of nihilism. How the self exists, all agree it doesn't exist in the way that it appears. But how then does it exist? And we see here differing presentations. And then depending on the practitioner's aptitude, they will assert one of these.
나 대체 나 내내 자 전시 선바 남기 다 풍부의 때도 당한 쪽에 잠만여샤 겁나데 가라스네 풍부의 때도 류라미네 네 가서래 랑게 생이네 지생이 다녀고 마치 거래 해서지 제가 랑게 생이 삼당하다 지생이들라 미다바 삼당 겁나 동아와 삼당 겁나 다시랑와 신유 주비 동아 삼당 겁나 되네 안에 다음에 봐 삼당 겁나 진짜 지생이 겁나들라 되네 기다 망불리거와 되네시 나델이야 도시 안 되네 죄래 수도하데 계신 뒤로야 마 죄래스 죄유론에 가서네 죄래스 루스 셈나 최남라 생이 니수 용다 배 자만여샤 공부자 돈다지바레 류당 초와 셈취시 셈미버시디시 나 델라 미네 곰두간의 공부를 델라 미네 생이 니수 용다데 용다베스도 랑게 생이의 지생이 다제 안에 가르쳐서 가리 공부에서 전바데 셰랍 잼비기 미 셰랍게 제바제시 공고를 해서는 온도스도 나지 송거래.
Now then, we've covered how bodhisattvas engage in the close placement of mindfulness on the body. First, holding the body with mindfulness, they investigate the specific characteristic of the body with wisdom, investigating its elements, earth, water, fire, and wind, and its composites of the elements, the objects of form, sound, smell, and touch. Thereafter, the bodhisattva engages in the meditation on the general characteristics of the body, holding the body with mindfulness, investigating with wisdom the impermanence of the body, that it changes momentarily, that secondly, that it is in the nature of suffering, thirdly, that it's empty of being permanent, unitary, independent, and fourthly, that the body is selfless. And we've just looked now at selflessness, also in terms of the selflessness of persons. So this is how a bodhisattva engages in the close placement of mindfulness on the body. Now we can turn to the text, and there's a quotation on page 3 from Vasubandhu's Treasury of Knowledge. Meditation on the close placement of mindfulness is done through the complete investigation of the two types of characteristics of the body, feelings, the mind, and phenomena. So this is just reasserting what we've been covering, giving a scriptural source for what has been covered thus far. So meditation on the close placement of mindfulness is done through complete investigation. Here we see mindfulness and wisdom. Mindfulness explicitly referred to or mentioned, complete investigation, meaning the utilization of wisdom, with the two types of characteristics, those we all now know of being the specific characteristic and the general characteristics, on the four observed objects of the body, feelings, the mind, and phenomena. And continuing to read in the text, immediately underneath, moreover, the general characteristics are impermanence, suffering, emptiness, selflessness. So this we've been looking at.
그래서 미다바 세야지 뒤지에 탐지 미다바 뒤지에 간지나 미다바레마도 미다바 망에 제어 말 뒤지 탐지 미다바 다 사시에 탐지 둥어와스네 사치게 최 간지 둥어와 레다 녀모부 원기 주위기 최텔라 네 사치 제로와 사치 레다 녀모 원기 주위기 비기 최 간지나 델라 둥어와라 그래서 사치에 탐지 둥어와스 나 최 탐지 동싱 세도다 최 간지네 道学让我进入这边动法的是动性是这个的。的呢，다음에 봐라 돼. 최 근데 지나 라게 투비 가서 라게 투비 세수 주바 되게 동바지 롱제자 많이 바래스. 롱제자 많이 바래스 다음에 바래스. 그래서 동신 다음에 봐. 디的 지칭시듯이 대 계시 자와 남 지칭이듯이 그래서 디 때도 계시돼서 자제 공명도 지칭이 공명듯이 요래지래. 쑥 말이다. 지단의 시고로 봤다. 내가 가르치는 뒤지에 가는 신나이 메다 말이었어. 레다 녀모 온게 중에가 있는 레다 녀모 온게 중에 최 가는 신에 둥아 말이셔 봐다. 다 최 가는 신에 최 탐지라 그러. 최 가는 신에 다시 라와진 루비게 가사 디게 롱어저저 마루바디 다 동화래. 최 다시 라와진 루비 동화래. 라기도 최 가는 신다 그러. 디 나시 최 가는 신에 가사 라디오 투비 세수 투비 디게 동화래. 사실 그러.
And continuing with the text, they are explained as general characteristics since they are pervasive qualities applied to a particular basis. That is to say, so now that what the text is doing is presenting the reason why these four general characteristics are characteristics in general. Firstly, relation to impermanence. All compounded phenomena are impermanent. Compounded phenomena are phenomena that have come together due to causes and conditions. Compounded, brought together, gathered together. And hence, because they are dependent on causes and conditions, they are impermanent. Suffering. Contaminated phenomena are in the nature of suffering. Phenomena are contaminated due to having being the ripening result of contaminated karma, and that karma was contaminated because it was accumulated through the power or the influence of afflicted minds. So because the karma was accumulated under the influence of affliction, such as, or in particular, the ignorance of self-grasping, the resulting karma from that act is contaminated, and therefore all contaminated phenomena are in the nature of suffering. So when the contaminated karma ripens, it ripens into contaminated phenomena, and they are in the nature of suffering. Thirdly, emptiness. All phenomena are empty. All phenomena are empty of being utilized by a person that is permanent, unitary, and independent. Fourthly, all phenomena are selfless. So all phenomena are selfless in that they are not utilized by a self-sufficient, substantially existent self.
Yeah. Adine delia da jele sin jege jege jawa de na kar song sin jele and dada ge rang ye chingi ni rang ye ngo ji chingi ni du je nam me da ba ni da sa che nam du nga ba ni da che tham je dong ba da da me ba ni do xie song ge xie sa da don da de xie sa ba da ga je rang ge chingi xie de ka re sa na rang ye ngo di re se de rang ngo di re xie da ji chingi xie de ka se du je tham je me da ba de re da ga je me da ba de xie sa che che ju du nga ba de xie che tham je dong ba xie da rang ye ka se da xue rang wa jing ju be dong ba xie da 다음에 봐 최탐제 가사랑이 지주비 동화세 디에는 지칭들이 에세데 다 녀시바다 지바다 호 직디.
A further quotation is given, this time from Vasubandhu's own commentary to the text that he composed. So it's this commentary to what was his own commentary to what was quoted above. Vasubandhu's auto commentary to the Treasury of Knowledge. The specific characteristics of the body, feelings, the mind, and phenomena are their individual entities. The general characteristics of the body, feelings, the mind, and phenomena are everything that is compounded is permanent. All phenomena that are empty are in the nature of suffering. All phenomena are empty, and all phenomena are selfless. So here, The second part, the general characteristics of the body, etc., this has just been explained immediately above. And then the sentence above this, relating to specific characteristics, is about to be presented.
Chögyi 생기 송고로와 진짜 미카시게 디용식으로 다 지천이제디 미다보 동아 다음에 매제 결혼 섬주진의 시행은 저 켈링메 사지 용식으로 와지다 디 결혼의 섬주로 와서데 제바이나 링의 섬주 말이에스 지산디 죄 나려야 르비 이니 송요레스 안 죄게 자완 디직마 장두두 파데 안 디마세 죄게 자위게 제와 나려야 안 죄게 제와 나려야 디 송요레스 지산 데네데 두아스 지산 디소 녜가랑게 다가스 삼라 젠유치네 쇠시게 말다 쿵다 룽요디 디소 니 두세 디소 소야디 돌아야 쿵도 송고레세디 마쿵 젠보임비게 김생 다 덴데 마노와 따다 임비게 김생데디 말쿵 장고레.
The purpose of including quotations is so that the author, in this case the Tibetan author of this text, Chögyi Gyältsen, can state very clearly to those who would read his text, both in his lifetime and afterwards, that this presentation is not something he has made up. There is a definite lineage, and this presentation can be traced back explicitly to Vasubandhu, to his Abhidharma text, and his auto-commentary to that, and through that to the Sutras of the Buddha. So therefore, those who come to read this text, both in Chögyi Gyältsen's lifetime and later, such as ourselves, we can have confidence in the lineage of this text. And it's not something that he made up himself, but can be traced back via Vasubandhu to the Sutras of the Buddha himself.
랑천 양 류라 중화당 중규기 류용오당 세드 랑산 세드 랑게 챙이시고래 제가 랑게 챙이세데 디치세데 데디 죄자와당 죄기 저완날데 송두와스 디송와인자다 랑게 챙이들 가르샤와스는 류를 바랑게 챙이세데 중화세데 사추 메롱시 중화 초바 중규랍도 지로랴자라 소바 숙자 숙지로랴자 데네기 초비고 오텔라 안 랑고 고레스 진짜 랑디 랑천야 류라 중화다 중규기 류교 오 시고로하다 데디징아도 디쇼가 디시에 말류고 랑고 어디.
Continuing in the text at the top of page 4. Thus, the specific characteristics of their individual entities, namely, with respect to the body, the entity of elements and composites of the elements. And this is what we looked at this morning. The elements of the body, earth, water, fire and wind, and the composites of the elements refer to the objects of form, sound, smell, and touch.
나 류데라 랑기 류다 아니 신가소레 난기 류다 치 류다 지나니게 류세랑 가서게 가사 디 류들 원래 개발 숨셔와 나 당하는 저기 류일 때도 되네 거면 여봐지 나 류려야 아니 이제 전주 선배기 류다 상기 류다 저준비기 류지소라 미네 잠만야샤 시고면 여러 말은 좀 거마 여러 와다 거면 여러 와 가서 류이테는 류 가르치테니나 잠만야샤 거면 여러 와다 다 거면 여봐야 한다 전주스마 파베기 꿀류라 때네 잠만야샤 거면 여러에서는 여래체 상기기 꿀류라 때네 류라 미체 아니 디텐데 잠만야샤 거면 여러에서는 고 여래세 자준비기에는 류라 미체 잠만야샤 거면 여러서 여래체로와 다 랑다 지천이 다녀 공부 제고로 공고로와 세상에 공고에서다 근데 전주스마 파비기 류다 자준비기 류다 상기 류디게 꿀류디게 다 랑지 천이 이거도 지바래 중화시다 중화시 초대열에 아니 지로자시 차상유도 좀 되게 고속수 주바리 랑이 뭐 삼제바제 여가지로와 다 지생이 나네 가르쳐 봐줘서네 미다바 임바디 제바제 요르고 미다바 기지기 지바로 미다바 임바 제바제 요르제 다 가르요 말에라면 누가와디 제바제 요 말에 그래서는 전시 심배 파비 유리다 사이 유kul리티게 누가와 말에 레다 녀모 오늘 중화 말에다고 제가 니데도 누가와 고메 요 말다 제바제 요 말에 매반자 랑게 다 다시 라완지 주비 동바디 제바제 요래 간사랑의 두비지 주비 동에 다음에 봐 제바제 요래 지생이 나네 지생이 미다바 당 동와 다음에 봐 숨디 제바제 고메 요래야지 제가다 가르요 말에서는 누가와 세야지 디텐도 제수iten도 누가와디 지생이나 누가와디 제바제 고메 요 말다 이 제사 디네인자 저기 잠만이죠. 검도 지층이 시가 차상 고며 유나 선백에 삼다반의 지가 차상 요구고 말에 매래. 단 디나신 딱바 쉬어를 되나 딱바를 되네. 안에 가서 잠만이죠. 시고며 여러 말에라네. 여러 와디야. 그 딱바세디 변행아서 뒤마시 남가세 딱바시 때때도 잠만이죠. 공부해나. 딱바 그런 거 기지기지 마지바 아니 띵도 내봐대 딱뭐 어디 찾으러 봐. 다 디데라 가르 고메요서 미타바 고메요 지생이 미타바 고메요 말에 안에 둥어 고메요 말에 고메요 말에 이 고메요 다 가르 고메요서 다슈랑와 진 주비 동어 고메요래 가사랑이 뒤비지 주비 동어 고메요래 제대 여반자 랑게 생이네 지생이 다녀 공부하지바 요래때 지생이 자산디 다녀 공부해요 말다 고메요 말 용고해요 말다 생이 고라다 랑게 생이네 지생이 다녀 공부하지바라고 제가 최탐직이 된도 최간적이나 디된도 안에 가서 그래. 잠만이제 시고며 요래. 잠만이제 고며 요래. 랑게 생이의 지생이 다녀 공부해 봐 요래. 이나 지생이디 가실을 여봐 가실을 매봐 나서 용식이래. 그런 거 랑게 생이 기지기지 마치 받으러 기지기지 마치 그런 땡자 내 받으러 땡도 내 받대.
Perhaps it was in our first session together on this text, when we were looking at the observed objects, and we looked at the observed object of the body and saw that there are three subdivisions. So from your recollection of those three subdivisions, on the bottom of the page, or the first page, one sees that it refers to all forms, not just one's own body, but all bodies. So therefore, in this meditation, a suitable observed object is one's own body, but also the bodies of others. So then one could have the question, so I can understand that I would approach the body of other ordinary beings who are similar to myself, approach that meditation on their body in the same way as I would my own. But what about beings who are extraordinary? Those who are Arya Bodhisattvas, who are foe destroyers or Arhats and Buddhas, such beings, is their body a suitable observed object for the close placement of mindfulness? And certainly they are. Certainly they are. So how then does one meditate on such a body? The body of an Arya Bodhisattva, or the body of an Arhat, or the body of a Buddha? Well, one would meditate in a similar way, not exactly the same, but similar way. Firstly, with mindfulness, one holds the observed object, investigates with wisdom, and one investigates the specific characteristic of, let's say, the body of an Arya Bodhisattva. And one would investigate in the same way. Then, thereafter, one would engage, utilizing mindfulness and wisdom, to investigate the general characteristics of the body of, for example, an Arya Bodhisattva. And we would investigate, but here there is a difference. We'd investigate the first general characteristic, seeing that the body too is impermanent. The third characteristic, that it is empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent, just like all phenomena are empty of being utilized by a person that is permanent, unitary, and independent. And fourthly, that it is selfless, just like all phenomena are empty of being utilized by a person that is self-sufficient, substantially existent. The exception comes with the second general characteristic, that of suffering. Because these three illustrations, the body of a Buddha, the body of an Arya Bodhisattva, and the body of an Arhat or a foe destroyer, are not in the nature of suffering. So therefore, when one performs this meditation on one of those three as the observed object, the meditation relating to its specific characteristic is the same, but in terms of the general characteristic, one only meditates on three of the four general characteristics. One meditates on impermanence, emptiness, and impermanence, emptiness, and selflessness, but not suffering, because those three bodies are not in the nature of suffering, because the cause doesn't apply to them. They did not come from contaminated karma, but pure karma, because the karma that led to those bodies was not accumulated with even the slightest, with any trace of the afflictions. Therefore, they were accumulated due to pure karma. Therefore, they came from a karmic seed, a ripening of a karmic imprint that is not contaminated, and therefore their bodies are not contaminated, and therefore are not in the nature of suffering. So then, furthermore, what about a permanent object, permanent phenomenon? How would one meditate on a permanent phenomenon, such as, for example, uncompounded space? So, uncompounded space, the permanent phenomenon of uncompounded space has as its specific characteristic that it doesn't change momentarily. It's a permanent phenomenon, so its specific characteristic is it does not change momentarily. Then one comes to meditate on the general characteristics, and here one only meditates on two general characteristics, emptiness and selflessness, recognizing that no phenomenon is utilized by a person that is permanent, unitary, or independent, or a person that is self-sufficient, substantially existent. So here we see that we can meditate on the permanent phenomenon of, for example, uncompounded space through two of the general characteristics, emptiness and selflessness. But not the first two, because a permanent phenomenon does not have the general characteristic of impermanence. Secondly, a permanent phenomenon is not in the nature of suffering, didn't come about due to contaminated karma and afflictions. So here, what we've seen in terms of when we meditate on the objects, the observed object of the body of a Buddha, of an Arya Bodhisattva or foe destroyer, and when we meditate on the observed object of a permanent phenomenon, such as uncompounded space, there is a specific characteristic that one meditates on, but in terms of the general characteristics, one does not necessarily meditate on all four, because the general characteristics are not pervasive across all phenomena.
Dinajin Lamen by Jajumba de Su Leje, Ya Janju Sim Gin, Janju Simba, the Tolamba, Jolamba, Kondu Pumpo di Tia, Dungi Pumpo de Goya Yoma, Tadi, Sevoro, Kavaraji, Sambara Charu. Jajumba La Yondaji, called Chimchu Machi, Kabar Machivana.
Perhaps some of you at home have a doubt here. When we talk about arhats, so I'm going to be now even more specific. But what has been said is certainly correct, but let's be even more detailed. So arhats, or foe destroyers, they have attained firstly nirvana with remainder, thereafter nirvana without remainder. If they have, so those who have attained nirvana with remainder, their body, their form aggregate, still is one that has come from contaminated karma and afflictions, and therefore they can be meditated on in terms of all four general characteristics. Their body can be meditated on through all four general characteristics, because an arhat who has attained nirvana with remainder, their body has still come from contaminated karma and afflictions. And this is also the case with ordinary bodhisattvas, bodhisattvas on the Mahayana paths of accumulation and preparation. Their body too has come from contaminated karma, and therefore their body is suitable to be meditated on through all four general characteristics. However, arhats or foe destroyers who have attained their second level of nirvana, nirvana without remainder, their aggregate, their form aggregate, has not come from contaminated karma, and therefore, for such an arhat who has attained nirvana without remainder, one would only meditate on their body through the first three of the four general characteristics: impermanence, emptiness, and suffering. Likewise, with Arya Bodhisattvas, so those who have attained the Mahayana path of seeing and the Mahayana path of meditation, as well as all Buddhas, their bodies too have come from pure karma, and therefore, not having come from contaminated karma, are not in the nature of suffering, and therefore can only be meditated on through three of the four general characteristics. So that is some more detail.
Alright, that Geshe Thubten Rabten Jampanya Shakom Nadi Xie Dang Aron Zuga Karchegore Send Dang Aron Zuine and Dinigi Yamlin Chehu or what Aron Karsene Jibar Tizan Dinigi Yamlin Chehu Dini Zada Yamlin Jeta Samdano Gomna Jibarwa Dang Aron Zugula Jezan Luce Tambo Sosoran Ludi Samta that Sosoran Ludi Modi Kanishes and that Juata Deni Junwa Shida Jungyurgi Denigi Topi Topachiri Zambiki Samda Denigi Samda do Denigi Samda Deni Ji Samda Jumit Nars Pumbo de Kiji Jibi Guard Mato Taba Timbo Neva Shiomare Samda di Samdang or Mitaba Samdang Denigi Samda do Nazo Karchawasene Mitaba Samda do Nazo Lamrim Yamle Chagore di Samda Lamrim Yamlen Sig also Malamado, Lamrim Yamlen Chagore, Dembashi Yamlen Chagore, as an answer Pumbo de some Pumbo de Kiji, Midabe, Dunga, Midaba, but Kiji Gurba some Tadim, and to give Chungi Lam Yudin Big Guard some Tango, Lamrim Chevan, give Chungi Lamrim, but Chua Midaba Comia, Mazu Ludi, and then she get 10 million bushes to Comiata, the Nigi Chua Midaba Comishima, Chesanga to Ludi Carson, Druati. Lui de Kanga Lui de Carres to Jua Shi Swan and Trupticana. The Negata Kiji Jiberan is Mitaba Comiatic. She had that Lamiki Chunga Lamirin by Yamlachigore. That the Neg Lui del Bade, Guganation and Dugus and Chesan Lui Tella, Dunga, Gu Dunga, Chesan, the Yungu, Chesan di Gudia, Du Chebachidu, Lui Mizawa, Deniki, Jelly Katsunyomo, Duashaki. Duashaki Gyälwa, Chakbe Gyälwa, and Leda Yomobalet in the Dugudua, Chesan Leda Yomo Onga Jungi, Pumbo Shidua, some died, Delang Zugi, Chi Dunga, the Gongor, Jebachigorwa, the Ne Jebachi, other Lamrim Kishe, give Jingi Lamirimba Share Chagora, Carson, the Nigim, Pumbo Tilla Dunga Gerashin, Chesan, Dikanga yos, tele the Targudu Sembeda, the Nigga Dunga, Rajimba, some down or did you delay the Targud, some ligua, just not hard to get some ligua, just a delegate, Korean as a Kibu Jingo, Koi Gyun Tongo, the Korea Gyun Dago, Esora, just a Gyun Datadi, Manjuki, Pumbodi, Dunga Rashim, but Jabachi do, Koala Gyun Da Chagore. Dembashi Nane Sheban, Dunga Dembala, Dunga Dembala Yamachi Chagore, or those Chagoro, and the Negi. Chayong. Now, Dene Jenedine, that Pumbo did Dendo, Mazu Shenada, Dashi Ramaji to be Dada, Kasa Raya to be Zisuba, Denegi, Da said Yomar Jebache, Denegi Jeban, Da said launches a Madubari, some time do, Dameba, Dameba, something or Chesa did some time do, Karshi was the Lambrim Chebaina, that Dele Tarduga Samba, that she Kunju Tembalia, Jebache, Kunju Tempi, Kunju Temba de la Targe, Dami Besant, J. Dameba, Tardu, Koala, Tarduga Samakiada. Dene, Tembashi City, Kunju Tempe, Namsha, Lamrimi, Lamding, Namsha Yamlejava, Gordenda, Tembashina, Gordinkita, and Lamdenda, Kunju Tempe, Yamlen Chevala, Gord, Letugurwa. Chizadine, and to some time, Lamrim Yamlen Jea Chagore, Tembashi Yamlen Jea Chagore, Majugi, and the Garsore, Jamanyasha, Lula Mipig, Jamanyasha, Combadia, Chasa Sungale, Santu and Chagore. Just not deneging to Chichabache some daddy, and then Rajugi, some Tana, the Dishowe Sheba Nashin, Jensen Banagidus, the Com Javanajing, Rajugi, some non, Dele Lula, some Dani Luli, Jambapa, dear Jambipa, Zi, Sem Shanam Mayan Wache. Lu Coron la Miche, lui di Teneshedo, sempre Jambi Zi, Tenesherapien, lui di Canes Negudu, Gyälwa Canes Trudu, Java Sherapa, Java Chedu, called Mitabico, some Tangoro, Odusine, Tanga di Java Jewa, Jambaina, to Java, and another similar to Monban, Damanya Gyälwa, Lela Rugorova, Tanya Rugorova. Jisadang Juki that the Lula Rangi Tsingi, the Anechike, Dichi Sing Mitapo, Dunga Dembeco, Dunga Dembeco Kishigoro. That then Ludi, that did and the Ludi and the Dunga Dembo Commuter, Ludi Dunga Bocomiodu, and Jukarel Tebara Chidule, and Yomot and the Kiwaris Kiliodu to Kunju Tebale, Kunjeba Charangua. That engages in and that Tonga Dame Bacheva Chidu, Teneco Gordenda and Lamdel Yamaja Chagorova.
I hope then that there's some clarity now in how bodhisattvas engage in the meditation on the close placement of mindfulness on the body. As non-bodhisattvas then, how should we approach this meditation? Well, in the same way as the bodhisattvas approaches meditation. And it's important that we do this meditation, even though we're not bodhisattvas, because in this way we create ever more causes to enter into the paths, to generate paths in our continuum. And moreover, so therefore we need to engage in this meditation. Moreover, when we do attain a path, due to our familiarity with this meditation, we will attain the actual realizations of this path ever more quickly. So therefore I'd encourage you to engage in this meditation every day. And one does it in the same way as bodhisattvas, utilizing mindfulness to hold the observed object, to hold the object that is being observed, and then to utilize wisdom to investigate first the specific characteristic of one's own body, seeing how our body is in the entity of elements and composites. Investigating this is the entity of our body. Thereafter, utilizing wisdom and mindfulness, one engages in the reflection on the four general characteristics of our body, reflecting on its impermanent nature, that it's not stable, that it changes momentarily. And this is a crucial meditation for us to do. It's a meditation that is in accordance with the Lamrim presentation on the trainings of a practitioner of initial capacity, we reflect on the impermanence of this life. So here we reflect on how this body is unstable, it's not reliable, it is impermanent, and therefore it changes momentarily. And this we need to do, to abandon grasping at it as being permanent. Moreover, then we move into the second meditation here, to see how the body Now I'm just missing something here, so just bear with me while I read the notes quickly.
Zogi Pumbo di Zogi Keji Jiba Samdode, Koji Mitaba Samdode, Mitaba Kungorwa. Then Mita Zogi Pumbo Dunga was some time to Dunga, you got it, Yaya Shed, you let a Yomopal, the Juarez, the Kunjutimba. Niba the Charu, Casane, Dunga, you luted.
Then, moving to the second characteristic, that of suffering. So we first reflect on impermanence. So thereafter, we've reflected on the first of the general characteristics in relation to our own body, and now we move on to the second, that of suffering, or more clearly in the nature of suffering. So here we reflect how this body is in the nature of suffering. It is the basis upon which we experience physical mental pain. It's the basis upon which we experience the suffering of transient happiness. And this is because it is an illustration of all-pervasive suffering. So here, we're meditating on the first of the Four Noble Truths, that of true sufferings. And then we go, which is a meditation in accordance with the trainings of a practitioner of intermediate capacity. Then we go deeper, still within the context of the second general characteristic of suffering. Suffering, why is this body in the nature of suffering? Why is it an illustration of the suffering of all-pervasive suffering? And that is because it's come about independent on contaminated karma, and that karma that has ripened into this body is contaminated because it was accumulated under the influence of the afflicted mind, in particular the ignorance of self-grasping. So therefore, this body is an illustration of a true suffering, and we've now also reflecting on true origins, the second noble truth, that this body has come about in dependence on contaminated karma, and that karma is contaminated because it was accumulated under the influence of the afflicted mind, in particular the ignorance of self-grasping. And here we're meditating now on the second noble truth, true origins. And this meditation then serves to lead us to giving rise to definite emergence, seeing that in samsara there is no peace to be found. It's not possible for there to be peace, for peace to be found, because our very body is in the nature of suffering. It is a true suffering that has come about in dependence on true origins. And therefore, no matter what life form we take, no matter what experiences one has within cyclic existence, we will suffer. So here, building on the first meditation of the first general characteristic of impermanence, we've come to the second general characteristic of suffering. And this leads to the meditation on true sufferings and true origins, leading to the arisal of the mind of definite emergence. Thereafter, we're ready to engage in the meditation on the third and the fourth general characteristics, seeing that there is no phenomenon that is utilized by a person that is permanent, unitary, and independent, and therefore all phenomena are empty of being utilized by a permanent, unitary, and independent person. Moreover, there is no phenomenon, or moreover, the self is empty of being self-sufficient, substantially existent. So here we've been meditating first on coarse selflessness and now subtle selflessness. So in coarse selflessness, we saw the person was empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent, and therefore there is no phenomenon that is utilized by such a person, a permanent, unitary, independent person. Now come to meditate on subtle selflessness, seeing that the person is selfless in that the person does not exist in the way that appears. It is not self-sufficient, substantially existent, and therefore there is no phenomenon that is utilized by a self-sufficient, substantially existent person. Here, there, when we're meditating on the third and the fourth general characteristics, with mindfulness and wisdom, we're meditating on true paths and true cessations, because it is these realizations of selflessness which lead to the attainment of true cessations through the cultivation of true paths. So here, what I've introduced here in our summary is how, through meditating on the four general characteristics in relation to the body, we are also meditating on the Four Noble Truths. And again, just to conclude, I encourage you to engage in this meditation of bodhisattvas, even though we are not yet bodhisattvas, because these realizations will help us attain the bodhisattva paths, and when we do, and we engage in the actual close placement of mindfulness, they will progress ever more rapidly.
Gyälwa chungi kablia nga songi dungalya nga song sumliya gyönta dene delaya tarduga samba chaya dene chiwa metaba komya sidi sheyadu ani gyälwa dingi kapso dene kamsum semjan korwe ganis gyälwa na chasan dungaya rangi samta da dene shedu gyälwa shigoro des maa shigore dadi di kapso dorduj madu shigo mara kasa dunga komsa metaba di komya 기준이 있다는 거 봐서 뉴뉴마도 시고 말. 그래서네 전유신배 냠내 제시도 디수니엘네 아주 장도르미니 냐만의 전유신 마기 냐엘네 고 가서로 데니기 차산 롭종 제시 장도르듯이 조사르와 제산 장도르 조사하다 델야 전유신배 냠내 가다 지그시에데 뉴뉴마도 뒤지마도 송고 말아 들들이. 그래서 아주 렘림 갑라 전유신 마기 냐엘야 롭종 제엘야 디시에데 그 개발을 시고라 되듯 마시고라 데 마뉴이 개발마도 단달라 다다디 잠만야샤시 공묘도 덴바시를 공부를 남리 디시레 다 남림 냠는 제나 덴바시를 냠는 지고래 잠바시 냠는 덴바시 냠는 지고다 남가래 냠는 지나 덴바시 토는 냠는 제마도 디 마디비 냠는 제제 메르다.
What's being presented here in terms of these meditations is very similar to what has been looked at previously in what you'll know from the Lamarim presentation. So we mentioned here that impermanence is a meditation that is shared with the practitioner of initial capacity, where they meditate on impermanence of life. They also meditate on lower realms and karma. Thereafter, the practices that are shared with a practitioner of intermediate capacity, they reflecting primarily on the sufferings of samsara, and thereafter they're reflecting on selflessness. So here, a bodhisattva is engaging not in those specific meditations, because prior to generating bodhicitta, in order to generate bodhicitta, they did engage in those meditations. So here, they are engaging in a meditation on the Four Noble Truths in a condensed manner. Prior to generating, but what this doesn't mean is therefore that those Lamarim meditations are unnecessary. Rather, prior to the generation of bodhicitta, the practitioner had meditated on the impermanence of life, sufferings of the lower realms, karma, sufferings of samsara in its entirety, in order to generate definite emergence and then later bodhicitta, and enter the bodhisattva paths. And in that process, when they're training to become a bodhisattva, they meditated on the Four Noble Truths as is set out in the Lamrim. Now that they have attained the bodhisattva paths, they continue to meditate on the Four Noble Truths, but they do so in a more condensed manner because of their great familiarity with the prior trainings of the Lamrim. And when they later progress through the bodhisattva bodhisattva paths, later the path of preparation and then seeing and so forth, all practitioners, whether they have yet to achieve a path, or they are bodhisattvas, or they are bodhisattvas, all meditate on the Four Noble Truths, but they do so in slightly differing manner.
당보 가르섬 당고스 당보 소수기 류디라 삼당고 지상 소수 류리야 둥아에 둥아기에 여봐 인규에 둥아기에 여봐 데네 지는 게도 두신 둥아 지상 낮에 땅에봐 제 소수 류리다 데네게 셴 아니 셴다 데네 류리 낮에 땅 두치데 제도 지상 류디도 송어의 송용도 중화시 라베게 두비게 중화디 송어의 송제 델야는 아주게 잠바디게 델마 류딜 파지 아니 셰럽기게다 낮에 되는 용도와 둥아 되는 용도와 새벽에 제바치도 랑의 챙이래야 제바치야디 시고다 무엇으로 랑의 챙이 제바치에서 치디베지 땅 매마도 아주 잠반여샤 고미야기 곰당 나신지 다 곰당의 시고 잠반 용무수 시고 말되네 잠반여샤 곰당의 시고로 받이라 진짜 되네게 지는 류일면에 류일라 다 지지도 진짜 류디야 치와 미다바레 시도 다 기지기지 지루 치루고래 그 템부 따바 템부 요마르 기지기지 지고르다 셰도 다 미다바 시고로와 진짜 잠반 예제깔에 지층이 풍부되는 지층이 공부를 지층이 미다바 겁나디다 진짜 풍부디 아주 가서 기지기 지루 치와 미다바레 겁나 겁여도 진짜 지층이 미다바 겁나 시고래 잠반 예제 겁나 시고 아디나신 당도 다 동아이 풍부디다 유 가르치 기고선 레다 녀모발레는 기도와 진짜 레다 녀모베 샤와전도 두신 두체 셰야도 디 단 잠바텐제 잠베기 잠바다 제 셰럽기 파 규티네 기도와세베 니 셰럽기 제바 지고로 봐 진짜 디텐도 류기텐도 가르치 고서는 동아에 된바 지체니 동아 된바 제바 제다디 다 하라 송고래 름리 냠다 제다 다 하라 잠만 예자 냠는 제사디 다 하라로 시고리네 칙 베제 땅야다 다디 가르마다 민가주 예니 잠만 정오수 셰야디 미 람닐 귤에 기에산에 디곰다디 오수 시고로 마도 디 고매기 장도르디 메넬람림 기부 총어다 딩기 냠는 제대 갑라 장도르디 지고르다 좀 고마지와
From your meditations and teachings you've received on the Lamrim, you'll be aware that here one is encouraged to meditate on one's own experience in samsara, to come to understand our reality better. So one, through Lamrim teachings, will meditate on how this body is a basis upon which we experience unwanted physical pain and mental pain. And moreover, this body is a basis upon which we experience the suffering of transient happiness. So we engage in this meditation through the Lamrim, and we also meditate on the various elements of the body, and as well as the composites that arise from the elements. So all of this we come across in the Lamrim, and we encourage to meditate with mindfulness and wisdom. So therefore, that presentation is not new to the Bodhisattva. They've been meditating in this way prior to generating bodhicitta. The difference comes between the presentation of the four close placements of mindfulness and the Lamrim presentation is more about terminology and whether the presentation is more expansive or condensed. So here we use a new term, specific characteristic of the body. Lamrim doesn't use that term, but the detail of the meditation is the same. Similarly, with the general characteristics. In the Lamrim, the general characteristics of the body being impermanent, suffering, empty, and selfless are not, that term isn't used, general characteristic. But one engages in the meditation that the body is impermanent, it's unstable and unreliable, and therefore will come to an end. Moreover, it is in the nature of suffering. It is the basis upon which we experience physical mental pain and transient happiness. Therefore, it is an illustration of all-pervasive suffering. And this is how we meditate in the Lamrim, seeing that the body is a true suffering. Moreover, we meditate in the Lamrim on what are the causes that have led to us, once again, unwillingly taking this body which is the true suffering. And those causes are contaminated karma and afflictions. And then this way, in the Lamrim, we meditate on true origins. And we see here, in the general characteristics of impermanence and suffering, one meditates on true sufferings and true origins. So again, the meditations are similar. The Lamrim is more expansive because that's what's needed at first to become a bodhisattva. But a bodhisattva still continues to meditate in the same way, but they can utilize a more condensed presentation due to all their prior training. So the meaning that is presented in the practice of the 4 close placements of mindfulness and the Lamrim is the same. The terminology may differ, but the meaning is the same. So thank you. Then that brings us to a conclusion of the meditation on the close placement of mindfulness on the observed object of the body. Next week, we'll continue to look at the second observed object, that of feelings, and we'll look then at how to engage in the close placement of mindfulness on feelings.